It was a wrong turn that led them there. The road through the forest had been winding and narrow, and when the sun began to dip below the treetops, Dan decided to pull over. His wife, Clara, rolled her eyes from the passenger seat, clutching the map she'd warned him to use earlier. "We're lost," she said flatly, glancing at their two kids in the back seat, Jack, 10, who was bored and restless, and Emma, 6, who clutched her stuffed rabbit like a lifeline. "We're not lost," Dan replied, forcing confidence into his voice. "We just need to figure out where this road leads." But as the car crept forward, the dense trees gave way to something unexpected. Bright colors peeked through the foliage, red, yellow, blue. Lights flickered faintly, blinking against the growing twilight. "What is that?" Clara asked, leaning forward. Dan slowed the car to a stop. Beyond the trees was a clearing, and in it stood a carnival. It looked old, its paint faded and chipped, but the rides were moving. The Ferris wheel turned slowly, its carriages swaying gently. The carousel spun in steady circles, its horses frozen in mid-leap. Booths lined the pathways, their striped awnings fluttering in the breeze. But there were no people. "It's a carnival," Dan said, though his voice carried no certainty. "Out here?" Clara asked. "That doesn't make sense." "I wanna see." Jack shouted, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Wait," Clara said, her tone sharp. "We don't know what this is." "Probably abandoned," Dan offered. "But if the kids need to stretch their legs." Before Clara could argue, Jack was already out of the car. The air in the clearing was strangely still. As the family stepped onto the carnival grounds, Clara couldn't shake the unease curling in her stomach. The lights on the rides flickered erratically, and the distant hum of a calliope echoed faintly, though she couldn't see any speakers. "This is weird," she muttered, keeping Emma close. Jack darted ahead, his sneakers crunching on the gravel. "This is so cool," he called, running toward the carousel. The painted horses seemed almost alive in the dim light, their glass eyes glinting as they spun. Jack hopped onto one, laughing as the ride continued to turn. "Jack, get off that thing!" Clara shouted. "But it's still running," Jack replied. "How is it still running?" Dan approached the carousel's control box. It was covered in rust, the lever frozen in the off position. "It's not even on," he said, stepping back. Clara's unease deepened. "Dan, this doesn't feel right. Let's go." But before he could respond, Emma tugged on her hand. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're looking at us." Clara frowned. "Who?" Emma pointed to a booth at the far end of the path. The sign above it read Funhouse, its colorful paint peeling. The windows reflected distorted images of the family, twisting and stretching their features into grotesque shapes. But Clara's breath caught in her throat. The reflections weren't quite right. Inside the mirrors, tall, faceless figures stood behind them. And then, slowly, the mannequins moved. "Dan," Clara whispered, her grip tightening on Emma's hand. "We need to leave. Now." Dan followed her gaze to the funhouse. His stomach dropped. The mannequins in the mirrors stood tall and unnervingly still, their heads slightly tilted as if watching. They didn't belong there, not in the carnival's warped reflections, and certainly not in reality. Jack squinted at the booth, oblivious to the growing tension. "What mannequins?" "It's just our reflection, Mom." But Clara wasn't imagining it. She was sure the figures had moved, their positions shifting subtly every time she blinked. "We're leaving," she said firmly, tugging Emma back toward the car. The calliope music suddenly grew louder, the cheerful tune distorted and warped. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating, as if the carnival itself was alive. As they turned to leave, a deep creaking sound echoed through the clearing. The Ferris wheel slowed to a stop, its carriages swaying in the still air. The carousel, too, ground to a halt, its horses frozen mid-gallop. "What the hell?" Dan muttered, stepping back. "Where's Jack?" Clara asked suddenly, panic rising in her voice. They turned to see Jack standing in front of the funhouse entrance, staring up at the sign. "Jack!" Dan called. "Get back here." Jack didn't move. His eyes were fixed on something inside the mirrors, his face pale. Clara ran to him, her heart pounding. "Jack, what are you doing?" I saw something," Jack stammered. "It was me, but, not me. It waved at me." Clara's blood ran cold. She pulled Jack away, but as they stepped back, the mirrors shifted again. The mannequins were closer now. One of them raised a hand, its movements jerky and unnatural. Dan grabbed Clara's arm. "We're leaving," he said, his voice tight with fear. They turned toward the path that led back to the car, but the clearing wasn't the same. The road was gone, replaced by more booths and stalls, their colorful lights flickering like dying stars. Where's the car?" Clara gasped. The calliope music shifted again, its melody slower now, almost taunting. "We'll find another way out," Dan said, though he didn't sound convinced. As they moved deeper into the carnival, the lights seemed to grow dimmer. The air smelled of stale popcorn and grease, mingled with something metallic and sour. Emma clung to Clara, her small body trembling. "Mommy, the mirrors are everywhere," she whispered. Clara glanced around and realized Emma was right. Nearly every booth had mirrors, funhouse mirrors, polished glass, even the glossy surfaces of the game stalls. In each one, the mannequins stood, watching them. "Don't look at them," Clara said, pulling Emma closer. Jack's breathing grew uneven. "Why are they following us?" "They're not," Dan said quickly, though his eyes betrayed him. "It's just reflections." But the mannequins didn't act like reflections. They moved when no one else did. They tilted their heads in unison, their faceless forms leaning closer as the family passed. One by one, the mirrors began to crack. The sharp sound of cracking glass echoed through the carnival, making the family freeze. The mirrors along the game booths and rides fractured one by one, the jagged lines spidering across their surfaces. "Keep moving," Dan said, his voice low and urgent. But as they hurried down the path, the mirrors didn't just crack, they moved. Clara looked over her shoulder and gasped. The shards of broken glass were shifting, reassembling themselves into jagged, floating shapes. The reflections of the mannequins moved independently now, their forms disjointed, stepping through the cracks as if the mirrors were doors. "They're coming out," she whispered. Dan turned and froze. One of the mannequins, taller than the rest, with unervingly long limbs, stepped fully onto the path. Its head jerked sharply toward them, tilting at an impossible angle. "Run!" Dan shouted, grabbing Jack's arm. The family bolted, weaving between booths and dodging toppled carnival signs. The once distant calliope music now seemed to be coming from everywhere, warped and menacing. Emma tripped, letting out a cry. Clara scooped her up, her pulse pounding in her ears. Ahead, Dan and Jack skidded to a stop. The path ended abruptly at the Ferris wheel. It towered above them, its carriages swaying gently in the eerie silence. The way back was blocked, the mannequins were closing in, their broken forms clicking and creaking with each step. "We'll climb it," Dan said, his voice desperate. "Are you insane?" Clara shot back. "Do you have a better idea?" he snapped, already boosting Jack toward the first carriage. The Ferris wheel groaned as they climbed, the rusted metal protesting under their weight. Clara helped Emma up, her hands trembling as the mannequins grew closer. Their movements were erratic, but deliberate, as though they were toying with the family. One mannequin reached the base of the Ferris wheel and stopped. It raised a hand, and the ride jolted violently, the entire structure shaking. "They're controlling it," Clara cried. Dan pulled Jack higher. "Just keep climbing." The Ferris wheel creaked and groaned as they scrambled upward. Below, the mannequins circled the base, their faceless heads following their every move. Emma clung to Clara, her tiny hands digging into her mother's shoulders. "Mommy, they're everywhere." Clara looked up and froze. The top of the Ferris wheel was lined with mirrors. Each reflective surface showed a distorted version of the family, Clara and Emma frozen mid-climb, Jack and Dan stuck in place. But in the mirrors, the mannequins were already at the top, waiting for them. "Don't look," Clara whispered, forcing herself to keep moving. But the reflections in the mirrors didn't stay still. The mannequins reached through the glass, their long fingers pressing against the surface as if trying to break through. One of the mirrors cracked. The sound of the mirror cracking sent a ripple through the Ferris wheel. The entire structure groaned as if alive, the metal trembling beneath their hands. "Keep climbing," Dan yelled, pulling Jack higher. Clara glanced below. The mannequins were still circling the base of the Ferris wheel, their heads tilted up, watching. But they weren't trying to climb. Instead, their fractured reflections continued to emerge from the mirrors, jerking and twisting as they clawed their way into the real world. Emma whimpered, burying her face in Clara's shoulder. "Mommy, I don't want to go up anymore." "We have to, sweetheart," Clara said, though her voice wavered. The top of the Ferris wheel loomed closer, the mirrors surrounding it reflecting distorted versions of the family's climb. In one reflection, Clara saw herself slipping, falling into the waiting arms of the mannequins below. She shook her head, willing herself to focus. "Don't look at the mirrors," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. But it was too late. Jack had stopped, his eyes locked on one of the mirrors. "Jack!" Dan shouted. "What are you doing?" "I see us," Jack whispered, his voice hollow. "But it's not us. They're smiling." Clara's blood ran cold. In the mirrors, their reflections weren't climbing. They were standing at the top, smiling blankly, their faces eerily still. "Jack, don't look." Dan grabbed his son's arm, pulling him upward. The first mirror shattered completely. The sound was deafening, like glass breaking inside their skulls. Shards rained down around them, and from the mirror's frame, a mannequin stepped out. Its limbs were jagged and sharp, its head tilting unnaturally as it moved. It grabbed onto the Ferris wheel, its long fingers digging into the metal. The structure groaned under its weight, tilting slightly. "Dan, it's climbing!" Clara screamed. Dan glanced down, his face pale. "Move!" Now. The family scrambled upward, the Ferris wheel shaking violently. The mannequin climbed with unnatural speed, its jagged fingers tearing through the rusted metal. At the top, the mirrors seemed to pulse, their surfaces rippling like water. More cracks spread across the glass, and the reflections inside began to move independently, their distorted smiles widening. "We're trapped," Clara whispered. Dan shook his head. "No, there has to be a way out. Maybe if we—" A second mirror shattered, and another mannequin emerged. This one was faster, its limbs contorting as it lunged toward them. It grabbed Dan's ankle. "Dan!" Clara screamed, reaching for him. Dan kicked frantically, his foot connecting with the mannequin's face. Its head snapped back, but it didn't let go. Instead, it climbed higher, dragging itself closer to him. "Help me!" Dan shouted, his voice panicked. Clara swung her arm, clutching the broken remains of a carriage railing. The jagged metal hit the mannequin's arm, splintering it. It let out a screech, its head snapping toward her before retreating into the shadows below. The Ferris wheel jerked violently, tilting further as the mannequins continued their ascent. At the top, the mirrors shimmered, their surfaces warping. The reflections of the family stepped forward, reaching for the glass. "Mommy, I'm scared," Emma cried. "I know, baby," Clara said, clutching her tightly. "I know." Dan's eyes darted around the top platform. "There's got to be something, a lever, a switch, anything." But before he could move, the largest mirror shattered, and a figure stepped through. It wasn't a mannequin. It was Clara. But not her. This version of Clara was twisted, her face frozen in a wide, unnatural grin. Her eyes were dark voids, her movements jerky and unnatural. "Leave," the reflection said, its voice a distorted mockery of her own. "This is our carnival now." The other reflections followed, stepping through the remaining mirrors. One by one, they surrounded the family, their blank eyes locking onto them. Clara's heart pounded as she looked at her own distorted face, the twisted grin spreading wider. "What do you want?" she whispered. The reflection tilted its head. "To take your place." The distorted reflections moved closer, their grins wide and unnatural. Clara clutched Emma tightly, her heart racing as the Ferris wheel swayed beneath them. The jagged limbs of the mannequins below scraped against the metal, their inhuman movements matching the erratic pulse of the carnival lights. "Stay back!" Dan shouted, gripping a broken piece of railing like a weapon. The reflection of Clara stopped, tilting its head at an unsettling angle. "You can't fight us," it said, its voice a mockery of her own. "The carnival needs you." "Needs us for what?" Clara demanded, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. "To fill the mirrors," the reflection said simply. The air grew heavy, the distorted calliope music now deafening. The reflections reached for them, their twisted hands outstretched. "Run!" Dan shouted, pulling Jack toward the edge of the Ferris wheel's platform. "There's nowhere to go," Clara cried. But Dan's eyes darted to the cables holding the Ferris wheel in place. One of them dangled just close enough to reach. "I'll lower you down," he said, his voice shaking. "What about you?" Clara asked. Dan didn't answer. He helped Jack grab the cable, his hands steady despite the terror in his eyes. "Climb down, buddy. Don't look back." Jack hesitated, tears streaming down his face. "Dad. Go." Dan barked. Jack nodded, gripping the cable tightly as he began to descend. Clara followed, clutching Emma with one arm as she slid down the cable. The metal was cold and slick, and her grip threatened to fail with each jolt of the Ferris wheel. Dan turned to face the reflections. They had surrounded him now, their blank eyes fixed on him. "You won't touch my family," he said, his voice low and steady. The reflection of Clara smiled wider, her head tilting further. "It's not up to you." The Ferris wheel jolted violently as the mannequins reached the top, their jagged limbs clawing at the platform. Dan swung the piece of railing, shattering one of the mirrors. The reflection inside let out a piercing scream, its form dissolving into smoke. But for every mirror he broke, another reflection stepped forward. "You can't destroy us," the reflection of Clara said. "But you can join us." Below, Clara and the kids reached the ground, their feet hitting the gravel as the Ferris wheel groaned above them. "Dan!" Clara screamed. He looked down at her, his face pale but determined. "Run!" he shouted. The mirrors began to shatter one by one, the reflections inside clawing their way out. The Ferris wheel tilted further, its structure collapsing under the weight of the mannequins and the twisted figures emerging from the glass. Clara hesitated, her heart wrenching. "Dan, no." But Dan turned back to the reflections, his jaw clenched. With one final swing, he shattered the largest mirror, sending shards flying. The Ferris wheel gave a final, deafening groan as it collapsed, the platform crumbling beneath him. Clara screamed as the Ferris wheel crashed to the ground, a cloud of dust and debris swallowing the clearing. The lights of the carnival flickered violently, the calliope music slowing until it stopped altogether. For a moment, the clearing was silent. "Dan!" Clara shouted, running toward the wreckage. But the Ferris wheel was still, its remains twisted and broken. The mirrors were gone, the reflections nowhere to be seen. "Mommy," Emma whispered, tugging at her arm. "It's over." Clara fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. When she looked up, the carnival was gone. The clearing was empty, the rides and booths replaced by overgrown grass and trees. The only sign of the Ferris wheel was a faint outline in the dirt, as though it had never been there at all. "Mom." Jack's voice broke the silence. "Where's Dad?" Clara didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on a small shard of mirror lying in the grass. In its cracked surface, she saw Dan's face, smiling. But his eyes were hollow, and behind him stood the reflections, waiting. The shard glimmered faintly before turning dark.